The snow was falling so hard that morning that even the sound of the wind felt heavy, but what chilled people most wasn't the weather. It was the sight of an old man sitting alone in a wheelchair, right in the middle of the neighborhood, slowly freezing while everyone looked away. Cars passed him. Curtains moved. Front doors opened and closed. Nobody stopped. The man's coat was thin, his hands trembling uncontrollably as snow gathered on his shoulders. His breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the icy air. He looked like someone waiting for help, for warmth, for someone to notice he was still there. But this neighborhood prided itself on perfection. Clean sidewalks. Identical lawns. Quiet streets approved by the HOA. And the man in the wheelchair didn't fit that picture. People whispered about him instead. He just sits there all day. I don't even know if he lives around here. Someone should call the HOA. And someone did. Within hours, an email circulated in the community, complaints about a disturbance near the road. The board promised to handle the situation. But handling, for them, meant ignoring. No one asked if he needed help. No one asked where he had come from. The snow kept falling. Across the street, from a tiny cottage that looked almost forgotten among the larger houses, an old woman watched quietly through her window. Her name was Eleanor. She had lived there for years, polite but mostly invisible, just like the man outside. She noticed what others didn't. His head kept dropping lower. His hands stopped moving. She pulled on her coat immediately. Outside, the cold hit her like a wall, but she walked straight toward him without hesitation. Snow crunched under her boots as she knelt beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes barely opened. His lips moved but no words came out. Eleanor looked around the street. Lights were on inside nearby houses. People were home. Watching. But nobody moved. Her jaw tightened. Without another thought, she gripped the handles of his wheelchair and began pushing through the deep snow toward her small cottage. It was harder than she expected, the wheels getting stuck, the wind pushing against them, but she didn't stop. Behind closed curtains, neighbors stared. Some shook their heads. Others simply watched. No one offered help. By the time she reached her door, Eleanor's hands were numb, her breathing heavy, but she got him inside. The warmth of her tiny home wrapped around them both as she closed the door against the storm. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know his story. But she knew one thing for sure. If she had waited for someone else to help, he wouldn't have survived the night. And what nobody realized yet, was that this single act of kindness was about to change the entire neighborhood forever. The small cottage felt like another world compared to the storm outside. Eleanor quickly shut the door, blocking out the screaming wind, and guided the wheelchair toward the fireplace. The old man's body shook violently, his clothes damp from snow. She moved with calm urgency, the kind that came from years of living alone and learning to handle things herself. She piled dry wood into the stove and lit a match. Flames flickered, then grew stronger, filling the room with warmth and soft orange light. Slowly, color began to return to the man's pale face. "You're safe now," she said gently. He blinked, struggling to focus. His voice was barely a whisper. "Why did you help me?" Eleanor paused, surprised by the question. "Because someone had to," she answered simply. She wrapped a thick blanket around his shoulders and disappeared into the tiny kitchen. Soon the smell of hot soup filled the air. Outside, snow slammed against the windows, but inside the cottage there was quiet, peaceful, steady, alive. When she returned, he tried to lift the bowl, but his hands trembled too much. Without embarrassment, she held it for him, letting him drink slowly. Minutes passed before he finally spoke again. "My name's Walter," he said softly. "Eleanor," she replied with a warm smile. Through the window, she noticed shapes moving outside, neighbors walking by, pretending to clear snow while sneaking glances at her house. News traveled fast here. They had seen her bring him inside. But still, no one knocked. Walter noticed her looking. "They don't like me," he said quietly. She frowned. "Why would you say that?" He gave a weak laugh. "I used to own the biggest house at the end of the street, before the accident. After the wheelchair, people stopped talking to me. HOA stopped listening too." Eleanor said nothing, but something about his words bothered her. Outside, another gust of wind shook the cottage. The storm was getting worse. Power flickered briefly, then returned. Walter leaned back, exhausted. "I think they forgot I was still here." Eleanor looked at him carefully. There was sadness in his eyes, but also dignity, like someone who had lost much more than mobility. She added another log to the fire. "You're not forgotten tonight," she said. Hours passed. Walter's breathing became steadier, his hands no longer shaking so badly. Warmth filled the room, softening the sharp edges of the day. Then Eleanor's phone buzzed. A neighborhood alert. HOA reminder: residents are advised not to bring unknown individuals into homes during community emergencies. Report suspicious activity immediately. She stared at the message, stunned. Outside, someone stopped near her window watching. Eleanor slowly lowered her phone. The storm outside wasn't just snow anymore. And she realized helping Walter might have just made her the HOA's next problem. Eleanor read the HOA message again, her fingers tightening around the phone. Report suspicious activity immediately. She glanced toward Walter, who had finally relaxed near the fire, his eyes half closed. The idea that he could be considered suspicious made something inside her twist. Outside, the wind howled harder. Snow covered the street completely now, turning the neighborhood into a cold, silent maze. Yet she could still feel eyes on her cottage. She moved the curtain slightly and saw two neighbors standing across the road, whispering. When they noticed her looking, they quickly turned away. The message had already started working. Eleanor sighed and set the phone aside. She wasn't about to throw a sick old man back into the storm just because the HOA felt uncomfortable. Walter cleared his throat. "They sent you something, didn't they?" She hesitated. "Just an alert." He gave a tired smile. "They don't like things that don't fit their rules." There was sadness in the way he said it, like he had learned that lesson the hard way. The fire crackled softly between them. "Did you really live here?" she asked gently. "In this neighborhood?" He nodded slowly. "Years ago. Before the accident. I used to attend every HOA meeting. People listened then." "What changed?" she asked. He looked down at his hands. "The moment I needed help instead of giving it." His words hung in the air. Eleanor felt anger rising, not loud or explosive, but deep and steady. She had always kept to herself, never wanting trouble. But hearing him speak made something clear: the neighborhood's kindness had conditions. Outside, headlights suddenly flashed across her wall. A dark vehicle stopped in front of her house. Walter noticed too. "That looks like the HOA president's car." Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Not friendly. Official. She stood slowly and walked toward it, heart pounding. When she opened the door, 3 people stood there, bundled in expensive coats, their expressions stiff. "Ms. Eleanor," the HOA president said politely, though his tone carried no warmth. "We've received concerns about someone you brought into your home." She blinked. "He's freezing." "I helped him." "We understand," another board member said, "but residents are uncomfortable. We need to ensure community standards and safety." Behind her, Walter lowered his head. Eleanor felt disbelief turn into anger. "He's not a danger," she said firmly. "He's a human being." The president's smile tightened. "Even so, we'll need you to cooperate." If this situation continues, the board may have to take formal action. Snow swirled between them as silence stretched. Eleanor realized they weren't here to help. They were here to control. She closed the door slowly without answering. Inside, warmth returned instantly, but her hands shook. The storm outside kept raging. And now she understood something clearly. Saving Walter was only the beginning. Because the HOA had just turned kindness into a conflict and they had no idea what was coming next. Eleanor stood by the door for a long moment after the HOA left, her heart still pounding. The wind rattled the windows, but inside the cottage the fire burned steadily. Walter watched her carefully, sensing the change in the air. "They came because of me," he said quietly. She turned and shook her head. "They came because they forgot how to be decent." He gave a faint smile, though sadness lingered behind his eyes. Eleanor returned to her chair near the fire and poured more tea. The warmth seemed stronger now, almost protective, as if the small cottage itself had chosen a side. Outside, the storm continued to bury the neighborhood. Walter stared into the flames for a long time before speaking again. "You probably deserve to know who you're helping." "You don't owe me anything," she said gently. He nodded slowly. "Still, I think you should know." He took a breath. "I wasn't always in that wheelchair. I used to run a construction company. Built half the homes in this neighborhood." He laughed softly. "Including some of the board members' houses." Eleanor raised her eyebrows, surprised. "Then the accident happened," he continued. "Car crash. Lost the use of my legs. After that, people changed." He paused. "At first, everyone promised to help. Meals showed up. Calls every day. But when recovery took longer than expected, they stopped coming." The fire popped softly. "And the HOA?" she asked. Walter's expression hardened slightly. "They said my wheelchair ramp didn't match community aesthetics. Sent letters. Fines. Meetings I couldn't even attend because I couldn't get there." Eleanor felt a knot of anger tighten in her chest. "They did that to you?" He nodded. "Eventually I sold my house. Thought it would be easier to disappear." Silence filled the room. Outside, snow piled higher against the windows. Eleanor suddenly understood the look she had seen on his face earlier. The loneliness wasn't new. It had been building for years. "You shouldn't have had to go through that alone," she said quietly. Walter shrugged. "That's just how things go." "No," she said firmly. "That's how people let things go." Her voice surprised even herself. Before either could say more, her phone buzzed again. Another HOA email. "Reminder, housing non-residents during extreme weather may violate community policy. Immediate compliance requested." Eleanor stared at the screen, disbelief turning into something stronger, defiance. Walter noticed her expression. "You don't have to fight them because of me." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not fighting because of you," she said. "I'm fighting because they're wrong." Outside, the storm finally began to slow, but the neighborhood remained buried in silence. Inside the cottage, a decision had quietly been made. Because Eleanor wasn't going to let the HOA push her around. And by morning, the neighborhood would learn something unexpected. The quiet old woman in the small cottage was stronger than anyone imagined. When morning finally arrived, the storm had stopped, but the neighborhood looked completely different. Snow covered everything in thick, uneven layers. Cars were trapped. Driveways disappeared beneath drifts. The world felt slowed, quiet, almost fragile. Eleanor opened her front door carefully and stepped outside. Cold air rushed over her face, sharp but calm compared to the night before. She looked back at Walter, still resting near the fire, finally sleeping peacefully. For the first time in years, he looked safe. She smiled softly and pulled the door closed behind her. Across the street, Neighbors were already outside, shoveling snow, checking damage, talking in small groups. Their conversations quieted when they noticed her. Some stared. Others quickly looked away. Then Mrs. Harper, a neighbor who rarely spoke, walked toward her hesitantly. "You helped him?" she asked. Eleanor nodded. Mrs. Harper glanced at the cottage. "Is he okay?" "He's warm," Eleanor replied simply. The woman hesitated, then said something unexpected. "That was kind of you." Before Eleanor could answer, another voice interrupted. "Kindness doesn't override community policy." The HOA president approached, boots crunching loudly through the snow, carrying a clipboard despite the freezing weather. Two board members followed close behind. Eleanor straightened. "We need to discuss the situation immediately," he said. Neighbors nearby slowed their shoveling, listening. "I already told you," Eleanor replied calmly. "He needed help." The president sighed dramatically. "This is not about emotions. Residents have concerns. You brought an unknown individual into the neighborhood during a storm." A few neighbors exchanged uncomfortable looks. Eleanor crossed her arms. "He's not unknown. His name is Walter." The board member frowned. "Regardless, rules exist for everyone." Before Eleanor could respond, the cottage door opened. Walter slowly wheeled himself onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket but sitting upright, stronger than yesterday. The neighborhood fell silent. Some people recognized him instantly. Whispers spread. "Wait, isn't that Walter Green? He used to live here." The HOA president's expression changed slightly, surprise flickering across his face. Walter looked directly at him. "Funny how I'm suddenly a problem again." The air grew heavy. The president cleared his throat. "Mr. Green, this is about safety standards." Walter let out a quiet laugh. "You said the same thing when you fined me for my ramp." Several neighbors turned toward the board members, shocked. Eleanor watched the mood shift. The story wasn't just hers anymore. The truth was coming out. More people stepped closer, listening now instead of ignoring. The snow reflected bright sunlight, making everything feel exposed, no shadows left to hide behind. The HOA president tightened his grip on the clipboard. "This discussion isn't appropriate out here," he said quickly. "We'll schedule a formal review." He turned and walked away, clearly uncomfortable. Neighbors watched him go. And for the first time, Eleanor noticed something new in their faces: doubt. Because the man they had ignored wasn't invisible anymore. And the quiet old woman who helped him had just changed the conversation in ways nobody expected. The moment the HOA president walked away, the silence broke. Neighbors began whispering to each other, voices low but curious. The name Walter Green moved through the crowd like a forgotten memory suddenly returning. Eleanor watched as people studied him more carefully now, not as a stranger in a wheelchair, but as someone they used to know. Walter breathed slowly, the cold air brushing his face. "Didn't expect to be recognized," he said quietly. Mrs. Harper stepped closer. "You really lived here?" He nodded. "House at the end of Cedar Lane." "Sold it a few years back." A man nearby frowned. "You were the one who built most of these homes, right?" Walter gave a small smile. "That's me." The realization spread quickly. Some people looked embarrassed, others shocked. They had passed him countless times without connecting the frail man outside to the successful builder who once shaped the neighborhood. Eleanor could feel the shift, sympathy replacing suspicion. "Why did you leave?" someone asked. Walter hesitated, then spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "After my accident, I needed a wheelchair ramp. The HOA said it didn't match community standards." He paused. "They fined me until I couldn't fight anymore." Gasps and murmurs followed. "That can't be true," another neighbor said. Walter shrugged. "Ask them." Eleanor saw anger building in the crowd, not loud, but steady. People were starting to question things they had accepted for years. Her phone buzzed. A new HOA notification. Emergency community meeting scheduled tomorrow evening. Attendance encouraged. She showed it to Walter. He chuckled softly. Looks like they're nervous. The wind picked up again, sending fine snow dancing through the air. Eleanor guided him back inside the cottage where warmth waited. Once the door closed, the outside noise faded. You didn't have to tell them everything, she said gently. Walter sighed. Maybe it's time someone did. He stared into the fire, lost in thought. I spent years believing it was my fault, he added quietly. Like needing help made me weak. Eleanor shook her head. Needing help makes you human. He smiled faintly. Outside, neighbors remained gathered, talking animatedly. The truth was spreading faster than any HOA notice ever could. For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel alone. That evening, several people knocked on her door not to complain, but to check on Walter. Someone brought bread. Another offered extra blankets. Small acts of kindness began replacing the silence that once surrounded him. As the sun disappeared, the neighborhood lights flickered on, casting soft glows over the snow. But Eleanor knew the calm wouldn't last long. Tomorrow's meeting wouldn't just be about Walter. It would be about years of quiet control. And when people finally spoke up, the HOA was going to hear things it never expected. The community hall filled faster than anyone expected. Usually, HOA meetings were quiet, a handful of residents discussing landscaping rules or parking violations. Tonight was different. Every chair was taken. People stood along the walls, whispering, waiting. Eleanor sat beside Walter near the front. He looked nervous but calm, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. She could feel the tension in the room like static before a storm. At the front table, the HOA board members shuffled papers, their confident expressions slightly strained. The president cleared his throat. Thank you all for attending. We're here to address recent concerns regarding safety and community standards. Murmurs rose immediately. A woman stood up before he could continue. We're here because you ignored a man freezing in the snow. Applause broke out. The president raised a hand. Please, let's remain respectful. Walter leaned toward Eleanor. This isn't going how they planned. One by one, neighbors began speaking. I didn't know what happened to Walter, someone said. Why didn't we hear about this before? Another added, if rules stop us from helping people, maybe the rules are wrong. The board shifted uncomfortably. The president finally looked directly at Walter. Mr. Green, we sympathize with your situation, but decisions were made according to policy. Walter's voice was calm but firm. Policy forced me out of my own home. Silence fell. Eleanor watched the faces in the room, shock, disbelief, even guilt. For many, this was the first time they were hearing the full story. She stood up slowly. I brought Walter into my home because he was freezing, she said. If that breaks rules, then maybe those rules need changing. More applause followed. A man near the back raised his voice. She saved his life. Why are we even arguing about this? The board members exchanged glances. The president adjusted his microphone. The HOA's job is to protect property value and neighborhood appearance. Mrs. Harper stood. What about protecting people? The room erupted again. Voices overlapped, residents sharing their own frustrations, small stories about fines, warnings, and rules that felt unnecessary. Years of silence spilled out all at once. The board looked overwhelmed. Finally, the president sighed. We understand concerns. The board will review current policies. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first sign of retreat. Walter leaned back, surprised. Didn't think I'd see this day. Eleanor smiled softly. Sometimes people just need to hear the truth. As the meeting ended, neighbors surrounded them, shaking Walter's hand, thanking Eleanor, offering help. The atmosphere felt lighter, warmer than the cold night outside. But as they prepared to leave, the HOA president approached quietly. He looked at Walter, then at Eleanor. "There are other matters we should discuss," he said carefully. His tone wasn't defensive anymore. It sounded worried. And Eleanor realized this wasn't over yet. Because the truth Walter carried reached deeper than anyone realized, and what came next would surprise the entire neighborhood. Outside the community hall, cold air rushed over the crowd as people slowly drifted toward their cars. Snow crunched beneath boots, but conversations remained loud and alive, neighbors talking openly in a way they never had before. Eleanor helped Walter toward her car when the HOA president called out again. "Mr. Green. Ms. Eleanor, could we speak privately?" The tone in his voice had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by something closer to unease. They stepped aside beneath a streetlight, its glow reflecting off the snow. The president cleared his throat. "There are details the board didn't want discussed publicly." Walter gave a dry smile. "That usually means they should have been." The man hesitated before speaking. "When your ramp request came years ago, several residents complained. They said it would lower property values. The board chose to deny the approval." Eleanor frowned. "So you punished him because people didn't like how it looked?" "It wasn't that simple," the president said quickly. "We were trying to protect the neighborhood." Walter's expression hardened. "You protected appearances, not people." The president looked down. "Maybe, we handled it poorly." For a moment, only the wind spoke. Eleanor watched the man carefully. This wasn't an apology yet, but it was the closest thing to honesty she had heard from the HOA. Before she could respond, voices approached. A small group of neighbors had followed, curious. Soon more joined, forming a loose circle. Word spread quickly that something important was happening. Mrs. Harper spoke first. "If mistakes were made, they need to be fixed." Others nodded. A man from the back added, "We trusted the HOA to do the right thing." The president looked overwhelmed as the crowd grew. Walter took a slow breath. "I'm not here for revenge," he said quietly. "I just don't want anyone else treated the way I was." Silence settled over the group. Eleanor felt pride swell in her chest. Even after everything, he wasn't angry, just honest. The president finally nodded. "The board will reconsider past decisions, and update accessibility policies." The words hung in the air like something fragile but important. Neighbors began murmuring approval. For the first time, the HOA representative looked less like authority and more like just another person standing in the cold. As the crowd slowly dispersed, several people stayed behind to help Walter into the car. Small gestures, steady hands, warm smiles, things that would have seemed impossible just days ago. Driving back to the cottage, Eleanor glanced at him. "Are you okay?" she asked. He smiled softly. "I feel seen." When they arrived, the cottage glowed warmly against the snowy night. Inside, firelight danced across the walls. Eleanor realized something had changed far beyond rules and meetings. The neighborhood wasn't just listening now, it was waking up. And tomorrow, a final decision would be made, one that would prove how much a single act of kindness could truly change. The next morning arrived calm and bright. Sunlight reflected off the snow, turning the entire neighborhood into a field of quiet white light. The storm was gone, but something deeper had shifted, not in the weather, but in the people. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching neighbors move about with new energy. Some waved when they noticed her. Others stopped to clear paths for one another. The silence that once filled the street had been replaced by small acts of connection. Walter sat near the fire, stronger now, a cup of tea warming his hands. Her phone buzzed. An official HOA email. She opened it slowly, expecting careful language or another warning. Instead, she found something she never thought she would read. Community Policy Update, immediate suspension of enforcement actions related to emergency assistance and accessibility structures. Formal review and public input to follow. She read it twice. Walter watched her expression. Good news. She smiled. Looks like they finally listened. A soft knock came at the door. When Eleanor opened it, several neighbors stood there: Mr. Collins, Mrs. Harper, and others holding small bags of groceries and fresh bread. We wanted to help, Mr. Collins said awkwardly. And, thank you. Eleanor stepped aside, surprised as they entered with warm smiles instead of suspicion. The cottage filled with voices and laughter. Someone added wood to the fire. Another pulled up extra chairs. Walter looked around, quietly amazed. This place feels different, he whispered. It's not the place, Eleanor said gently. It's the people. Later that afternoon, the HOA president arrived alone. No clipboard this time. He removed his hat respectfully. I came to apologize, he said softly. We lost sight of what really matters. Walter nodded slowly. Just make sure it doesn't happen again. The man agreed and left without argument. As evening approached, Eleanor and Walter stepped outside. The air was cold but peaceful. Smoke curled from chimneys, and neighbors waved as they passed. For the first time in a long while, Walter didn't feel invisible. You know, he said, looking out at the street, I thought this neighborhood forgot me forever. Eleanor smiled. Sometimes people just need a reminder. They stood quietly, watching children play in the snow where fear and judgment had once lived. One old woman had chosen kindness when everyone else looked away. That single decision had exposed silence, challenged authority, and brought a divided neighborhood together. The HOA had ignored the man in the wheelchair.
But one person had seen him and is doing so. She reminded everyone of something: simple rules may shape a community, but compassion is what truly holds it together. As the sun disappeared behind snow covered rooftops, Eleanor closed her door, warm light spilling into the cool evening. Outside, the neighborhood felt different now, not perfect but human.